You'll be generating MACD crossover signals like an absolute pro by the end of this episode. There's a couple of things you'll need in order to complete this episode. The first thing is a way to retrieve OHLC or candlestick data that you'll be using to trade with. I'll be using MetaTrader 5, and in my previous episodes on this channel, I show you how to use Python and MetaTrader 5 together in order to get that information. You can use whatever exchange you like, but you will need to be able to retrieve that information. The second thing you need is the MACD indicator and a way to calculate it. Now, once again, in my previous episode, I show you how to do that, and you're absolutely welcome to pause here and go and check it out. I've linked it in the description, but you will need to be able to calculate it for yourself. If you've got all of those things together, let's continue. Today's episode is part of a 4-part series I've been doing on the MACD indicator. While we don't have time to go through everything about the MACD indicator today, I did want to quickly outline for you some of the pieces of information that we'll be using. The first thing is to realize that the MACD itself is actually comprised of 3 separate pieces of information: the MACD line, the MACD signal line, and the MACD histogram. The MACD line is comprised of the input 2 EMAs and the difference between them. The MACD signal line then is an EMA of the MACD line itself. And the MACD histogram measures the difference between the MACD line and the MACD signal line. It does sound a little bit complicated, and if you do want to research it further, I really recommend my MACD indicator video. However, for today's strategy, the MACD crossover strategy, we'll be looking at the MACD line and the MACD signal line. Effectively, what we want to do is to generate buy and sell signals depending on when they cross each other. When the MACD line crosses below the MACD signal line, we will generate a sell signal. And when the MACD line crosses above the MACD signal line, we'll generate a buy signal. Now, for today's episode, I have just used arbitrary values for the take profit and the stop loss. You're absolutely welcome to modify them yourself or modify the input EMAs. I simply wanted to show you how to build your own MACD crossover strategy signal generator. I hope you enjoy. We'll be encapsulating our entire EMA cross strategy within its own file today. That'll make it really easy to refer to when we go back to our main.py in the future. So to get started, create a file in your file system called MACD underscore crossover underscore strategy.py. And that's where we're going to be placing the guts of the strategy. At the top of this file, start by importing a couple of different pseudo libraries that we've developed in earlier episodes. All these do, if you haven't developed these before, is just import our MetaTrader 5 interface, which allows us to get our candlestick data, and then import our indicator library, which is where our MACD indicator is calculated. If you haven't got them, I'm sure you've got an equivalent, so just make sure that you have imported them in. Now we're going to be defining our overarching strategy. How I like to kind of work my strategies is I define one function that kind of stitches everything else together. And then underneath that function, I'll actually define all of the different pieces of getting data, calculating the indicators, and then calculating the signals. If we were going into the auto trading piece, we would then create a 4th one at the end, which I'll show you like a placeholder for it, which would then kind of go ahead and make those trades. We won't be covering that today. We'll just be generating the buy and sell kind of signals. Now, as you probably see with all of my code, I love to comment it. And commenting is like a way to be awesome to your future self. I like to think of commenting as a way to make an investment today, which is going to save future you many hours of unnecessary time trying to figure out what happened. And the strategy itself has several inputs. First of all, we have our symbol, which is obviously the symbol that we want to be trading. That can be anything from a Forex pair to a cryptocurrency pair to a stock, whatever you happen to be trading for today. Then we need a time frame, which we're going to be applying our strategy to. That can be any of the time frames that are supported by your exchange. And then we have the MACD inputs, and that's where we have our fast EMA, our slow EMA, and our signal EMA. You'll also see that I've specified there an exchange, and that's so that you can add a different exchange, or in future episodes on my channel, I'll be adding different exchanges like Binance or potentially Alpaca.markets. Okay, so all of those things need to be in there, but I have put default values for the MACD fast, MACD slow, MACD signal, and the exchange. All of the MACD ones are the standard ones that you normally use when you're using the MACD. Obviously, pending, you might want to use different ones. And then the exchange will be MT5. At the end of the strategy, we're going to return a data frame which has our signals for buy and sell in there. Here's the steps that we go through every time we're developing a strategy. The first one is going to be how we get our data. So effectively, we need to have a piece that goes ahead and gets the OHLC data for our strategy. The second thing we need to do then is calculate our indicators. So that is going to be things like our MACD indicator. There's one other indicator we'll be calculating, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. The third step then is using those indicators, applying the rules that we'll be using for our strategy to generate the buy and sell signals. And I'll talk through what I've done when we get there. I do want to stress I've only used arbitrary values for this. So please don't go ahead and just use this to trade with. This is purely for demonstration purposes only. Obviously, I hope that they're profitable, but I haven't done any back testing at all. So I make absolutely no guarantees about it. All right. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is just define what I'm going to be doing. So keep in mind, I haven't actually built these functions yet. So you'll see in my pie chart there that it's going to generate a whole bunch of errors, basically saying, I don't know where these functions are. And we'll get through to those functions later on in this episode. Okay, just passing in the value. So the data that we're going to be getting is our symbol, our time frame, and then determining what exchange we're getting it from. Okay, our second step then will be to take that input data and calculate our indicators on it. See there where I pass the MACD fast, slow, and signal values off to it. The third step then will be to calculate, the signals that we want to use for it. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually update this function to include values for the ratio of your profit, take profit to stop loss. I'm not going to do that here simply because I think that it adds a lot of unnecessary complexity. You're more than welcome to do that if you'd like to. Now, if we were auto trading, which is where we take the next step and actually buy and sell based upon these signals, then we would have a fourth step, which would be to pass the signals that we're generating off to our auto trading bot. And we do things like calculate our lot size and so on and so forth. You can see an example of that in previous episodes that I've done. And it may well be that in the future I come back and actually generate a MACD auto trading bot just to demonstrate it. Okay, so let's start by defining those functions. And near the end of this episode, I'll come back and add a return statement to that one we just did. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is get our data. That's really important. So obviously we need OHLC or candlestick data in order to calculate our MACD and then figure out where to go from there. The things that we're going to need is to know what symbol we're getting, what time frame we're getting, and then where we're getting that information from. Okay? It's really important to pass a data frame. That makes it way easier to add information to in the future. Okay, now you'll see here as I go in and add in the code to get it from MetaTrader, I do just want to make a quick note about the number of candlesticks that you need to retrieve. When we're using smaller EMAs like 12 and 26, 1,000 is like a bit of an overkill. But if you really want to go above an EMA 200, you really need to think about how many candlesticks you're retrieving. A rule of thumb that I often use for myself is at least 5 times the number of the EMA that I want to calculate. So for an EMA 200, I want 1,000 candlesticks. If you're using an exchange like Binance, they will only allow you to retrieve at most 1,000 candlesticks for most of their calls. And so that means that if you want to do like crazy EMAs and your backtesting indicates some sort of crazy value, make sure that you've got a way of getting that extra information. It's really not important for this particular episode, but it's just one of those quick little gotchas that can really kind of save you a lot of heartache. You'll see here I added an error statement. So if I was to pass in an exchange that's not supported, it's going to throw me an error rather than just going nuts and not doing anything. This at least will tell me what the problem is and sort of make it easier for me to troubleshoot. And then if all of that works, as you'll see in a moment, we go ahead and return that data back to the function. Okay, if we go back to our parent function, we can see that we've covered off the first step. All right, let's talk about the second step. This is where we're going to calculate our indicators. So effectively, we get our data, and now we want to pass it into a function that goes ahead and calculates any indicators that are relevant for the strategy. Now, for today's one, we're using the MACD, but you could absolutely use this pattern to develop your own custom indicators, and I've certainly done that for some of my clients. Okay, now we're going to pass it all of the values for the MACD. And then I'll add in my comments as always. Another fun fact here, we are using TAlib to do a lot of our back-end calculation. You can build your own if you want to. Just be aware that building your own EMA calculator can really slow things down. For instance, if I was to do an EMA of like 10,000 rows, that might take a couple of seconds to calculate. When you consider that this function is going to calculate multiple different EMAs, something to consider. All right, so data frame, now we're going to get our indicator underscore lib.calc MACD. A link to the episode where I show you how to do that is in the description. And we just pass it all of our MACD fast, slow, and signal values. So far, so good. Now, the thing is, we're actually looking to do a MACD crossover function. And that means that we have a second indicator which needs to indicate when the MACD line and the MACD signal line cross each other, as I explained earlier. So this means that we need to build that into our indicator library, and it's just a simple crossover one. So to do that, head over to the indicator underscore lib thing, or you could do it at the bottom of this particular file if you are not using the same pattern of pseudo libraries as I am. And let's add in a function to calculate a line and a signal line crossover. Now, one of the cool things about doing this is we can actually make that quite generic. A crossover function for technical analysis is quite a common kind of thing to use. The RSI uses it when it crosses the 70, and all sorts of different technical indicators use it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a generic crossover function which takes any two columns of a data frame and basically tells you when they cross each other. Okay, so we're going to pass it our parent data frame or our main data frame, and then we're just going to specify the two columns that we want to see if they cross each other. The cool thing about doing this is that, you come back and you want to use a different technical indicator and it's got a cross in it, you can just absolutely pass the data frame in with the two columns and you're set. Brilliant. Okay, adding in the comments for the code. Now, how this works, or kind of like how this function works, is it basically creates two extra columns on the data frame, which we later delete. And it basically compares them together. So basically it says if column 1 is greater than column 2, put true. And if the position and preposition columns are equal, then there's been no cross. However, if they're not equal, then there has been a cross. And then once we have a cross, we simply add a third column, which says cross equals true. And then we delete the position and preposition columns, leaving just the cross column. Okay. We also want to drop any NA values. That will just prevent future errors. And make sure that we put in there in place equals true so that it just does it on the existing data frame. Okay, now I've specified the cross column as crossover, and then we simply do a little lambda function using NumPy on the data frame. It's a simple little function here, and because we're just doing it all sort of in the matrix of the data frame, it's really, really fast, which is really important when you want to do algorithmic trading. Near the end of this function, I'm just going to clean up the position and preposition columns. Effectively, after this calculate crossover function, I don't really need them anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of them so they don't sort of pollute my data for the rest of the strategy. And then we're going to return the completed data frame back to the calling function. Very cool. So let's head back to our strategy file. So once we've calculated our MACD, we now want to calculate when our MACD line and MACD signal line cross each other. We're going to use the function we just created to do exactly that. Now, all of this code that I've been using is captured on the Algorithmic Trading Bot GitHub. There's a link to that in the project description. With our indicators calculated, we're going to return this back to the calling function. As you can see, we've now covered step 1 and step 2. So let's get into the true meat of the strategy, which is calculating our signals. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this particular video, I've just come up with these take profit and stop loss and buy stop, sell stop prices, really just as arbitrary values to demonstrate what needs to happen. So when you see these values in here, just be aware that you can and should go in and change them to match your strategy. They're really there just to demonstrate how to do it. Because of that, the calculate signal function only takes one input, which is the data frame. And you could, if you wanted, extend that to include your take profit, stop loss kind of values and whatever ratio you wanted to use. If you're trading foreign exchange, for instance, you might want to make the stop loss to be 10 pips below the last price or something like that, whatever kind of works for you. And then at the end of this, we're going to return a data frame with all of our buy and sell signals on there. That'll make it really easy for you to backtest if you wanted to, and can also just be a really handy way to just review the work and see if it works. So we start in this particular function by adding in columns for our order type, stop price, stop loss, and take profit. These are kind of like placeholders, and it just allows us to fill up the data frame with zero values for anything that's not going to be traded. So for instance, when crossover is equal to false. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through each line of our data frame and check if it's generated a true value for crossover, which means that a trade needs to occur, and then calculate what those values would actually be. How we'll be doing this in this particular strategy is looking at a signal value, and that kind of indicates the direction of the cross as well. So a default value is 0. That means there's been no cross and it's not going in any direction. If a crossover occurs, which is the if row brackets crossover, we want to check if the MACD line is above the signal line. If it is, we're going to set our signal to be 1. If the MACD is below the signal line, in which case it'll be a sell, we want to set the signal to be -1. So 1 equals a buy, -1 equals a sell. Okay. Keep in mind that in order to get to this point, there has to have been a cross. So if there has been a cross and after the cross, the MACD is below the signal, then it's a sell, indicating, according to the theory of the MACD, that the price is about to go down or is going down. So if we have a signal equals 1, we're going to go ahead and calculate all of our values. And I'll put comments in here that show you the values where you should be updating for your own take profit and stop loss. So the order type is going to be a buy stop. That doesn't need to change. This does need to change. So I've just decided that we're going to set the stop price to the high of the previous candle. No real reason for it. I could argue that maybe it's a way just to make sure that, the price continues to move in that direction. And that would probably be what I would do if I was, doing this for real. But in reality, like I said, this is just to example how it can be done. For a buy stop, then the stop loss will be the low of the previous candle. Then the take profit is going to be a 1-to-1 ratio, which simply means we take the distance between the stop price and the stop loss, and we add that to the stop price. If you were to set it to 1.5 or 2, that's really, really easy to do. You just add a multiplier to this distance value. Okay, now if the signal is equal to -1, it's a sell stop, and we're basically just going to do, for this particular strategy, the exact opposite. So all of the stop loss, is going to be the high of the previous candle. The entry price or sell stop is going to be the low of the previous candle, and our take profit is going to still be a 1-to-1 ratio. So we'll go ahead and fill that out now. You can see there each time I'm commenting where you need to change your stop loss and take profit values. Distance will then be the stop loss minus the stop price, because for a sell stop, the stop loss is always going to be higher than the entry price. And then we set our take profit. Now we want to go through and update the values in our data frame. You can see here that that pie chart is now notifying me that there could be scenarios where we don't get an order type stop price, stop loss, or take profit value notified. That's because we've only taken care of when the signal is equal to 1 or -1, but the vast majority of the time it's going to be equal to 0. Now, while technically I could just leave this because we did preset the values at the start of the function, I always think it's good practice to make this as complete as possible just to stop any random errors. So I'm just going to go through now and add in those default values back in just to make sure that there's never any problems with it. Okay, and you can see that that kind of warning has gone away now. And at the conclusion of all of that, we return the data back to the function. Then, at the conclusion of the parent function, we want to return that back to wherever we're calling from. Now, you could run that strategy as is, but the issue will happen if you get a true value on the very, very first row of your data frame. And the reason for that is because as part of our take profit and stop loss calculation, we use index -1. However, if the first row of our data frame is the one that generates a true, there is no -1 to get there. We could also probably say that across 1,000 rows, the first value is probably not going to be accurate or even that necessary to start with. So to get around that, we're simply putting in a little bit of a function here, or sorry, not a function, a couple of lines to skip the very first row of the data frame. We do that by figuring out what the index is, where it starts, and then only allowing signals that are greater than that index to be calculated. Quick little function, save you heaps of heartache. Let's finish up by adding our amazing little strategy into our main function. Now, you'll probably see in my main there's a whole bunch of code that I've already put in there. You can absolutely go back to my previous episodes to see how that's all done. All it really does is call in the function, call in the strategy, call in a couple of startup things to make sure that MetaTrader 5 has started effectively. As you can see there, import the MACD underscore crossover underscore strategy, and then make sure that it's working. So all we're going to do now is update main. Okay, I'm going to be using ETH/USD with a 1 hour time frame, and then we're going to print it to the screen. There you go. There is the strategy there. But you can see here that there's a whole bunch of times where nothing's really happening. If you really wanted to do a little bit of back testing, maybe have a look into how the strategy is going, we could further filter this down by only printing to the screen the values that are true. So let's quickly do that now. Let's give it a go. How good is that? You can see all of the different rows there with all of the data.